Okay, so this is the Bible study for 1 Samuel chapter 8. And the text says, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, you are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, they displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. And they have done as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know that the king who will reign over them will claim as his what the king that will reign over them will claim as his rights. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and others will plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you that day. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like the other nations, with the king to lead us and to go out before us to fight our battles. When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. Then Samuel said to the Israelites, everyone go back to your own town. All right, so remember, you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive so that you can follow along with us as we study and read the questions. So number one says, what do we learn about Samuel's leadership at the end of chapter 7? So if you remember, we studied this last week, the end of chapter 7. And it says, Samuel continued as Israel's leader all the days of his life. He went and he judged, and it tells us where he judged and where he always went back to, and he held court and he built an altar there at Ramah. So it tells us a lot. Even before that, it told us about peace that came and the fact that they had no fighting with the Philistines during that time, and they came to peace with the Amorites. So that's the overall thing that we learn about Samuel and how he led and what type of leader he was and what kind of time it was in Israel's history. So number 2 says what happens now in 8:1 and 2. So he appoints his son as Israel's leaders. But his sons, in the second part of this, what do we learn about Samuel's sons in 8:3? His sons did not follow in his ways, and then they turned aside after dishonest gain and accept bribes and perverted justice. Now, specifically in this case, it's talking about the way they judged, which was what Samuel was doing, really following in the ways of Moses. in the way he oversaw and led Israel. And he was more so the judge of Israel and meting out judgments and the will of God for their specific situations. It doesn't talk about Samuel's sons being priests per se in the way that we learn about Eli and his sons, but it is true that we see a little bit of something that sounds familiar, a person of God who was faithful and whose sons did not follow the same path. And even though he put them in leadership and they weren't doing what was right in that leadership. So that's sort of setting the stage for what's going on here. It's probably not the focus of this text, because the heading over this says Israel asked for a king, and that's kind of the headline. That's the significant thing that happens in this text, more so than a description of Samuel's sons. We almost kind of skip over that. So number 3 says, what happens in 8:4 and 5? 8:4 and 5 say, so all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, you are old and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us. So they asked him to appoint a king in 8:4 and 5. The second part says, how did Samuel respond to the elders according to 8:6? It says, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. He didn't answer them right away, but he was upset. He was bothered, and he prayed to the Lord. Now, there's a whole different discussion that we could have about whether it was legitimate for them to ask for a king, given the fact that their judges were not being fair, and whether it was legitimate for Samuel to be upset when he had appointed his sons to be those judges and leaders, and they were not being fair. But nonetheless, they were asking for a king, and God seems to handle it, I think, in a balanced way. And we're going to get into that. So, but Samuel prays about this because he's displeased. And the third part of this question says, how did God tell Samuel to handle this request, according to 8:7 through 9? It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. So obviously Samuel, as the leader of Israel, might have felt rejected when they wanted a king. And God assures him that they weren't rejecting Samuel, they were rejecting God himself. And let me just say that the process of the judges, the way Israel was led under Moses, under Samuel, under the judges, was that basically Israel followed God. And the only time Samuel really got involved was when people didn't know what the will of God for a situation was, and two people perhaps had a disagreement about the will of God in a situation, and then Samuel had to be the judge, or Moses had to be the judge. And apparently, even under Moses, that was getting a little out of hand. And it seemed like people often couldn't come to agreement and didn't know what God's will was in a situation, because they were coming to him so often that he was day and night judging, and didn't have any other way. So he had to appoint judges based on what his father-in-law Jethro told him. He appointed judges, and they only brought the hard cases to him, by the way, which is the foundation of our court system in America as well, because things can be appealed to higher courts if the judgments are not don't seem appropriate. So I think we see, even under Moses, that people are not really good at knowing and discerning the will of God and following the will of God without somebody to mediate between people who seem to disagree on the will of God and what's right in a particular situation. And but that was the way Israel was set up. God was supposed to be king. Samuel was not the leader of Israel in the traditional sense that we think of even today. I mean, he wasn't even a president. He wasn't a king. He wasn't. He was supposed to be expressing the will of God when there was question about what the will of God was, and judging between people who seemed to have opposing views of what was right and what the will of God was in a situation. And it was God who was the leader, and Samuel was just expressing God's will. And that was the way it was set up. But now they're asking for a king. And so Samuel feels rejected, but God says, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. I'm the king that they're saying they don't want to be king anymore. B says, they have rejected me just as they have since I brought them out of Egypt. Ouch. So that was God's judgment. He doesn't say, oh, Samuel, this is a sad day. I never thought it would come to this. He says, don't worry, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. They've always rejected me. This is what they've done ever since I led them out of Egypt. So that's pretty rough assessment. That's pretty rough judgment of the people who are supposed to be the people of God, and see God as their king. And then C, listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his right. So I would say that it's significant that this they wanted a king like everybody else around them had. God is trying to express to them that you can have that, but if you have that, you're going to have all of the repercussions that come along with having what they have. And that is, that king will tax you. He will draft your people into the military and various services. He will have your people, they won't have a choice and they'll have to work for him. And they will essentially be slaves to this king that they've asked for. Your sons and your daughters, the people after you, as this goes along, will suffer for this decision that you've made. And that's true. That was true of the other kingdoms around them that they wanted to be like. That's true still today. Even in a representative democracy like we have, we have not for some time, but have had a draft. There are requirements. So God spoke this to me not too long ago, and I shared it with a few people already. But um, uh, one of the things I believe God said specifically to me, and this, I'm gonna try not to get too political, but this is a little political, is if you think that the government is the solution to your problems, then you better be willing to give up the things that you're going to have to give up in order for the government to solve your problems. And here's what I mean by that. If you think it's the government's job to solve, for instance, the COVID pandemic, if you think that the government's job is to protect us from something like this, then you better be ready to give up some of your rights and to do the things that are required for them to fix the problem. Okay. Now I think that's been one of the political discussions we've been having. A lot of us perhaps don't think it should be the government's job, and we are willing to not say that it's the government's job, and we're willing to sort of take on whatever consequences that means, find somebody else or solve the problem ourselves or whatever. Unfortunately, as a society, we're not really good at working together to solve problems without a government. Isn't that the same thing that God through Samuel is warning the people of Israel here? You can ask them to solve the problem. You can say, these judges aren't fair. We want a king. We want a leader. We want a system of government. We want somebody to solve all these problems for us. But in order to solve those problems, they're also going to take something away from you. The truth is, and this I don't think is political, this is just a truth, that the more we want the government to solve, the more we have to be willing to give up. The less we want the government to solve, the less we need to give up in order for the government to solve those problems. Now, we all fall in different places on the spectrum as to where we think the right place to fall. Some people, the government, because some people have lifted up China, for instance, as, they don't have this problem or they don't have that problem. Well, yeah, because the government just solves it all. I mean, we don't know how they solve it, but they make sure it doesn't happen. And there's not a lot of freedoms that go along with that. Okay. A government solving no problems means that the problems exist and we don't give up, any of our rights, including there would be no laws. We hold on to our right to murder one another too. If we don't have a government, the exact opposite of sort of a totalitarian government would be anarchy. Most of us feel like somewhere in between is a better place to be. We don't agree on where that is. Right. So I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that the warning was that if you can't seem to organize yourselves and figure out what is right on your own, and that is true to the point that you want a king and a government like other people around you have, you must know that you're going to give up a lot in order to have that. And maybe it would be better to just trust God in this and be selfless. And I know that we have varying degrees of belief about whether that can really happen in this sinful world. We're talking about sort of a utopian commune where everybody can deny themselves and everything will go fine. And I don't know that in this sinful world I've seen that happen or have much confidence in it happening. I feel like we should have pockets of that within the church. Now, one of the reasons that I shared some of those things about our current government and the decisions we made is because the reason I feel like God told me that about, if I want the government to solve my problems, I better be willing to give up whatever rights are necessary in order for them to accomplish that goal. The reason I felt like God told me that is because I felt like he was trying to tell me to stop blaming the government for certain things, stop blaming the mayor for certain things that are going on in our city that I don't like. And because if it's the mayor's fault or if it's the mayor's job to solve it, then I'm going to have to be willing to give up whatever it takes to give up for them, the mayor and the city government, to solve it. If I decide that it's not the mayor's fault and it's not the mayor's responsibility, but rather it's my responsibility, then I won't give up rights in the same way that I do. If the government solves it, I'll give them up in a different way. I will willingly give up my rights. I will willingly work on some things and be selfless in order to try to lead in the solution. And that's what I felt like God was telling me. So so what would it have looked like then if the Israelites, rather than demanding a king who was going to take away their rights, actually chose to deny themselves and come to solutions on their own without needing leadership and even judges to have to constantly decide God's will in every situation. What if I realized God's will was for me to be selfless and deny myself and maybe not take people to court? And I know that seems idealistic, but the point is that God allowed for government in this situation. God allowed for people to have the ruler that they wanted, but he pointed out that what they were doing was choosing not to have God's best, choosing not to be selfless in such a way that God's best came about without that sort of judge or ruler or king to come over them. And because of that, they were sacrificing something of what they had, and they needed to know that decision. So anyway, number 4 says, what according to 8:10-17 will the king claim as his rights? And this is a long list. A, he will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, right? That's a military service we're talking about. He will take others to plow his ground and reap his harvest. He will take others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. D, he will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. E, he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. That's sort of a tax situation. F, he will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Another tax. G, your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. And H, he will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. So he's saying this is what it looks like. You can have that ruler, but this is what it's going to look like. That ruler will solve some of your problems. You will go to battle behind him. He will go to battle for you. But what's he going to need from you in order to solve those problems? Well, this is what he's going to take. And you could have trusted in God, and it would have been different. Number 5, what does Samuel tell the people will happen when the king has taken all this from them? According to 8:18, he says, when that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. So let me just say, on these days when we are praying for relief from our government, and perhaps that's what we're doing, I don't know, depending on what political party in the year, I suppose you may be crying out to God, asking for relief from whatever tyrannical president we currently have. I wonder what it would sound like if this was applied to us. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen. And I don't want to make this about the president, the particular president that we've chosen at any given time, but I think even our system of government, regardless of the president, rules us in such a way. Maybe it's the best in the world. I don't know. That's what many of us have thought. But regardless, we see what it's taken from us because we can't seem to govern ourselves in the will of God. And it says, when we cry out to God because of the king that we have chosen, the Lord will not answer you in that day. So I just want to consider that. I'm not saying God's not going to answer your prayers. If you're praying for our president, praise God. If you're praying for our leaders, praise God. But if you're crying out for relief from a government that we have chosen, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if this curse applies to us, but man, maybe it does. Maybe we have like all humans, it seems now, maybe we have failed to govern ourselves in such a way that was truly selfless and allowed for us to um, mediate our differences without going to some system of government. And maybe in failing that and asking for a government to take care of it, we've chosen the difficulties that come along with us with that, and God has given us what we want and may not deliver us from that if that's what we're asking for. So I want us to consider that. I want us to actually, I feel like the way God spoke to me, he may be speaking to us, and there may not be anything we can do in particular about our government and system of government these days. Maybe there are some things, I don't know, but I don't know if we're going to completely undo this and get into that sort of utopian communal system. But let me just say that the reason that hasn't worked, doesn't seem like it will work, is because of us and our hearts and our unwillingness to be selfless. So at whatever level we can be selfless and solve problems by coming together as the people of God and coming up with solutions and leading in the solutions, the more we do that, the less the government has to step in. I mean, let's just use the COVID pandemic that I talked about. What would have happened? We can complain about what was imposed upon us by our government, but what would have happened if we had willingly and selflessly went about to protect people from illness on our own, and agreed together to do that? Would we have had to have such stiff imposed guidelines put on us? And I think that takes the blame away from the government and starts focusing in on ourselves, which is what, by the way, scripture is about, and God is talking about to us about ourselves, not about somebody else that's doing wrong. God's talking to us about how we could be different. And I'm just suggesting that what would happen if the people of God chose to be the people of God and actually do the things that the people of God should do and live the way that the people of God should live? Wouldn't it be true that if enough of us did that, that there would be less imposed rights taking that was needed? So the funny thing is, we usually behave the opposite. The more people start, the more the government seems to pull things away from us, the more we buck against and demand our rights. And that just makes the thing worse. Isn't it true that the more selfless we are, the less we would the less the government would need to solve these things for us, because we would be coming up with solutions for ourselves. And this is where God usually takes me when I'm thinking about these things, is I can think about what they should do and what they should do and what they shouldn't do, but God likes to say, okay, I can't control all that. What I can control is this. And is what I'm doing helping the situation or hurting it? So anyway, let's continue on. Number 6, well, let's see. How will God respond? He won't answer on that day. Doesn't that sound harsh? Well, sort of, but is it harsh to give us what we've asked for? And one of the things that we still have trouble with today is we want to be able to do what we want, but we don't want to have the consequences. And so if God gives us what we want and he says you're going to have the consequences and I won't come in and take those away because I warned you in advance that that was going to be the consequences, that's really not harsh. They're given they're given the whole picture up front, and they're told that they have a choice. They are free to choose. And if they choose this, this is what they're going to get. And they shouldn't need for him to intervene and take away that consequence in the end, because they chose that consequence. And isn't that true in our lives too? If we're crying out to God to take away the consequences of our own actions, especially when God has specifically told us in advance, this will be the consequences of these actions. If you choose this, you can choose it, but this is going to be the consequences. It's up to you. I'm not going to take those consequences away when you decide you don't like them because you chose them. That's really not harsh. That's fair. Number 6, how did Israel respond to Samuel's warnings according to 8:19 and 20? It says, but the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like the other nations with a king to lead us and to go before us to fight our battles. So they said, nope, we don't care what the consequences are. This is what we want. Number 7, what does God tell Samuel to do about this according to 8:21 and 22? He says, listen to them and give them a king. Number 8, do you think God ever gives us what we want, even though it is not his will and it's not best for us? I think so. I think he gives us exactly what we want, to the extent that sometimes we choose hell for eternity, to the extent that we've had the opportunity to have relationship with him or eternity apart from him, and we choose apart from him because we don't want to step into his will and all that he wants for us. And so we've stepped apart from him and he gives us what we want. I think that's the story of our lives. We have a choice. We can choose his will and what comes with that, or we can choose separation from him, and whatever that looks like. Have we ever come to regret the things that we asked for when the warnings came true? I would imagine so. Yes, I have. Usually I didn't really believe that it was going to happen, that was going to be the consequence. And I was arrogant and thought I knew everything and thought I knew better than God. And so I found out when the consequences came that I was wrong, and I've definitely regretted that. And I regretted it enough to really commit that I don't want to make that decision anymore. And every day I ask for God's help to do his will and not be arrogant like I have been in the past and choose my own way.